I was recently in a quiet, glass-walled office overlooking the Han River, sitting across from a man who has spent 30 years in the upper echelons of Korea's Ministry of Trade. He wasn't looking at trade schedules or quarterly projections. He was staring at a single, thumb-sized piece of high-bandwidth memory HBM resting on a velvet cloth. He didn't call it a breakthrough or a product. He looked at me, tapped the table, and said, "The Americans think they're taxing a commodity. They don't realize they're taxing their own brain." Just a year ago, the mood in Seoul was almost apologetic. The expectation was the usual one. Washington squeezes, and Korea, the shrimp between whales, gracefully absorbs the pain to keep the alliance intact. There was a sense of weary resignation about the raw deal of being a junior partner. But then, as the 2026 tariff threats turned into reality, something in the air changed. The frantic calls didn't come from the Korean side this time. They came from the AI architects in California, realization dawning that their trillion-dollar data centers were essentially expensive bricks without these tiny stacks of Korean silicon. My contact described a recent meeting with a U.S. delegation where the usual diplomatic niceties were replaced by a cold, surgical silence. When the Americans pushed for tariff concessions, the Koreans didn't argue about trade data or international norms. They simply mentioned that domestic supply prioritization might unfortunately delay the next HBM shipment. The shift was instantaneous. The faces across the table went from aggressive to ashen. This sudden reversal from the nervous compliance of a dependent ally to the calculated leverage of a technological gatekeeper is more than just a trade dispute. It is the emergence of a corporate feudalism that views semiconductors not as exports, but as hostages for national survival. It leaves you with a chilling question. In a world where Korea holds the keys to the digital empire, who is actually holding the leash?
That silence, that cold, surgical silence in the meeting room. I mean, that's the sound of the entire global economic order, just skipping a beat.
We're talking January 2026, and it feels like the tectonic plates have shifted under everyone's feet. But, I don't think most people have even felt the tremor yet.
And what you just described, it's more than a trade dispute. We aren't just talking about ships today. We are, and I think this is the core of it, we're analyzing a civilizational survival strategy.
A civilizational survival strategy. That's a heavy way to put it, but it feels right. It feels like a movie script. The one where the quiet, reliable sidekick suddenly pulls a gun on the main character. Right. We're just so used to the narrative of America snaps its fingers and its allies, especially in trade, they fall in line. But that story, that wasn't compliance. That was a threat.
It was a very polite, very quiet, but incredibly potent threat. It was a hostage negotiation, plain and simple.
Right? To understand how we got here. How South Korea went from this shrimp between whales to a technological gatekeeper holding the keys.
Exactly. And to do that, we have to look at the immediate trigger. It's not just about tariffs in a vacuum. It's about a piece of legal text that most people have never heard of, a no less favorable clause from back in November 2025.
Okay, let's unpack that, because it sounds like the kind of dense legal jargon that puts you to sleep, but it seems to be the lit fuse here.
And on the surface, it was supposed to be a win for Korea. It's a fairness guarantee, basically. The clause says, look, whatever trade deal you give to your other semiconductor partners, you have to offer those same terms to us.
Treat us as well as you treat your best friend. Simple enough.
Simple enough. But then Washington turns around and cuts a new, very specific deal with Taiwan. And the terms of that deal were, let's say, uniquely tailored.
What were they?
We will give you massive sweeping tariff relief, but, and this is the big but, only if you build a huge amount of your production capacity right here on American soil.
Which, from the U.S. perspective, makes perfect sense. They want to reshore the supply chain, they want the jobs, the security. I get that.
Of course. It's a logical move for them. But because of that no less favorable clause, Korea is now legally bound to match those exact terms if they want the same tariff relief. Washington is essentially calling their bluff. They're saying, hey, you wanted the same deal as Taiwan? Great, here it is. Start pouring concrete in Arizona.
And this is where the whole thing just grinds to a halt. Because my first thought, and probably yours too, is, well, why not? Samsung has mountains of cash. SK Hynix is a giant. Why not just build the plants in Texas or Oregon and make the problem go away? Why escalate it into this standoff?
This is maybe the single most important distinction that gets lost in all the headlines, and it's something we have to get really clear on. It all comes down to the fundamental difference between a foundry business and a memory business. You cannot treat them the same way.
Okay, break that down for me. Let's assume I know absolutely nothing about silicon.
Perfect. So think of TSMC in Taiwan. They run a foundry. A foundry is like a bespoke tailor on Savile Row in London. You the customer, say Apple or NVIDIA, you walk in with your design. You get measured, you pick the fabric, you tell them exactly what you want.
And the tailor doesn't start cutting until I've put down a deposit.
Exactly. They don't cut a single piece of cloth until you've agreed to pay for the finished suit. They are building it for you. It's a custom manufacturing service. The risk for the tailor is incredibly low because they know every suit they make is already sold.
Low risk, high value. Now, what about the other side?
Now, you look at Samsung or SK Hynix, they're in the memory business. This is not Salvaro. This is the Gap or Uniqlo. They're not waiting for an order. They have to guess what the market will want 6 months from now. They have to manufacture 5 million blue T-shirts in advance, put them in a warehouse, and just hope that people still want blue T-shirts when winter's over.
That sounds like an absolute nightmare if you guess wrong or the economy suddenly tanks.
It's high-stakes gambling with silicon, billions of dollars at a time. If demand for PCs drops, or a new phone doesn't sell well, or the tech just shifts, you are sitting on warehouses full of unsold inventory that is becoming obsolete by the second.
Wow.
That is the memory business. It is a brutal commodity market. It's fiercely cyclical, it's volatile, and the profit margins are, frankly, razor thin compared to the high-end logic chips TSMC makes.
So telling a tailor like TSMC to open a new shop in the US is one thing. It's expensive but doable. But telling a mass manufacturer like Samsung to build their factory in the US, where labor, electricity, regulations, everything is more expensive,
Is like asking them to commit financial suicide. It's not an exaggeration. If you are making a low-margin commodity, you have to make it the most cost-effective place on earth. You can't make it in the most expensive country in the world and expect to compete. It completely breaks the business model.
And it's not like this is a theoretical problem for them. They've tried this before, right?
They have the scars to prove it. And this is a piece of history that is absolutely critical to understanding their mindset today. You're talking about Hynix in Oregon.
Yeah, tell me about that.
In the mid-2000s, Hynix, now SK Hynix, made a massive bet on the U.S. They poured, I think it was over $1 billion into a huge fabrication plant in Eugene, Oregon. It was meant to be their flagship American operation.
And what happened?
The 2008 financial crisis happened. The memory market crashed, as it always does. And that brand new billion-dollar facility became an albatross around their neck. It wasn't just a loss on a spreadsheet. It was a corporate catastrophe. They had to lay off 1,400 people.
I can't even imagine.
For years, the images of that empty, hulking shell of a factory were a symbol of failure. That memory is burned, absolutely seared into the institutional psyche of every single Korean semiconductor executive.
So when Washington comes knocking in 2026 and says, build here, they're not seeing an opportunity. They're seeing the ghost of 2008. They're seeing empty parking lots and billions of dollars just flushed down the drain.
That's precisely it. They look at the U.S. proposal and they have a visceral, almost allergic reaction. They literally cannot afford to move the mass production of memory chips to the U.S. So they are caught. They're completely stuck. They can't build the factories, but they also can't afford the new tariffs.
So what's the only card they have left to play?
The chips themselves.
That's supply.
The supply. They're effectively saying, we can't build it there, so you have to keep buying it from here. And if you try to make that impossible by taxing us into oblivion, we will just slow everything down.
That is the hostage strategy. It's defensive realism in its purest form. They aren't trying to conquer the world. They're just trying to survive in a really tough neighborhood.
But, to really understand how an entire country gets to the point where it can mobilize like this, where it can turn an industry into a weapon with that kind of discipline, we need to get out of the boardroom. We have to look at the engine, the machine that makes it all possible.
The mechanism.
The mechanism. The cable.
Right. And I want to take you to a place that feels a million miles away from that glass office on the Han River we started in. I want to tell you about the first story from our research. Let's talk about a man named Kim Min-jae.
The data cleaner.
The data cleaner. Yeah. So picture a room in Gangnam, but I want you to forget everything you think you know from Gangnam Style. This isn't the glitzy part with the boutiques. This is a Gosi one.
And for those who don't know, a Gosi one is?
It's basically a glorified closet that you can rent. We're talking maybe 3 square meters. It's a bed, a desk, and that's it. No window, or if you're lucky enough to have one, it just stares at a brick wall 2 feet away. The air, from what I've read, always smells like instant ramen powder and stale recycled air conditioning.
It's a purely functional space, not for living, but for existing.
Exactly. And this is where Min-jae exists. He's a data cleaner for a small contractor, a subsidiary of one of the major Chaebols. I found his story, or one like it, on a private worker forum. He works 16-hour shifts.
16 hours.
16 hours. Every day. He says he's fueled by those little vitamin jelly packs and cheap caffeine shots from the GS25 convenience store downstairs. His job is to sit in front of a screen and monitor yield rate data from the HBM production lines. He's just staring at these cascades of numbers, looking for the tiniest deviation, the smallest drop in efficiency that could signal a problem.
A single bad batch could cost millions.
Millions. And he does this every single day. No real overtime pay, no union rep he can complain to, no work-life balance litigation. But here's the thing that absolutely floored me. He's not angry, or at least not in the way a Western worker would be. He's not writing manifestos about exploitation.
So how does he see himself?
He describes himself as a cog in the fortress wall. He told this forum that he knows if he misses a single data point, the yield on wafer might drop by a fraction of a percent. If the yield drops, the shipment gets delayed. And if the shipment is delayed, Korea loses its leverage in the trade negotiation with America.
Wow.
What?
That is a profound psychological difference. He's connected his personal exhaustion directly to national security.
Directly. He doesn't see himself as a victim of a corporation. He sees himself as a soldier for the nation. And this is what the West just fundamentally doesn't get. We look at that and we see brutal exploitation. The sources we've looked at describe it as the Chaebol edge. It is a level of disciplined mobilization that we simply cannot replicate in a Western democracy that values, sleeping 8 hours a night or seeing your family.
Mobilization is the perfect word there. Because to understand why Kim and Jae accepts this, and more importantly, why the Chaebol can demand it, we have to go back in time. We have to talk about the architect of this entire system. We have to talk about Park Chung-hee and the 1960s.
The military dictator who essentially built modern Korea from the ground up.
He's a military man through and through, trained by the Japanese Imperial Army in Manchuria during the war. He didn't view the economy as a marketplace of individual actors. He viewed it as a battlefield, a theater of operations.
And when he took power in the coup, South Korea was, well,
it was one of the poorest countries on earth, poorer than most of sub-Saharan Africa. It was dust and rubble left over from the war. There was no industry to speak of.
And his solution wasn't, let's open up the markets and let the free hand decide.
God, no, not even close. His solution was what our sources call corporate feudalism. He handpicked a few ambitious, ruthless families, the founders of what would become Samsung, Hyundai, LG, and he made them a deal they couldn't refuse. He created the mutual guarantor system.
Okay, what does that mean? How did that actually work on the ground?
The state, under Park, controlled all the banks. Specifically, the Korea Development Bank, the KDB of Park, essentially went to these families and said, I will give you unlimited state-backed loans at zero interest. I will erect massive tariff walls to protect you from any foreign competition. I will socialize all your risk. If you try to build a shipyard and it fails, I, the state, will cover the loss.
If I'm a CEO in 1970s Korea, that sounds like a blank check. It sounds like a license to just get rich. Here's free money, go wild. Isn't that a recipe for massive corruption and inefficiency?
You would think so. And in almost every other developing nation that tried this model of state-directed capitalism, that is exactly what happened. The cronies took the state loans and they bought villas in France and parked their money in Swiss bank accounts.
Not in Korea.
Not in Korea, because Park Chung-hee had a, let's call it a lethal catch. He demanded performance. He set brutally ambitious export targets. If your company met its export target for a year, you got more cheap loans, you got to expand, you got richer. But if you missed the target...
What happened then?
Well, your loans were immediately called in, your company was forcibly dissolved, and its assets given to a more successful rival. And you might find yourself having a very unpleasant one-on-one conversation with the KCIA in a dark basement somewhere.
So it wasn't just grow or die, it was export or die, literally.
Literally. And that created this culture of centralized mobilization that persists to this day. In the West, we have fragmentation. If the U.S. government wants to build a new chip factory, think about the process. They have to pass a bill in Congress, fight with the opposition party, deal with years of environmental lawsuits from local groups, negotiate with powerful labor unions, and then hope the company's shareholders approve the capital expenditure. It can take a decade.
And in Korea.
In Korea, the president says, we need to dominate the HBM market. The technocrats in the Ministry of Trade draw up the plan, the state-owned banks provide the capital, and the Chaebol execute. Period. It happens almost instantly. There is no debate.
You mentioned the technocratic elite. Who are these people?
They're the brain of the operation. These are the people who pass the Hynix, the senior civil service exams.
And those exams, they're famously difficult, right?
Imagine the LSAT, the bar exam, and a PhD dissertation defense all rolled into one, and you have to pass it in your early 20s. If you pass, you are basically set for life. You're treated with the kind of reverence an imperial mandarin would have received in dynastic China. These are not politicians worried about the next election cycle. These are cold-eyed calculators who stay in the Ministry of Trade or Finance for 30, 40 years. They plan in decades, not 4-year terms.
So you have this iron triangle, the state planners, the state banks, and the cabal.
And it's a closed loop. The technocrats form the brain. The cable are the muscle. And people like Kim Min-jae and his Goswan, they're the blood cells carrying the oxygen, keeping the whole machine running at a fever pitch.
So when we see Min-jae working himself to the bone, he's part of a direct lineage, a system. It started with the steel mills of Pohang and the shipyards of Ulsan in the 1970s. The product has changed from steel beams to HBM chips, but the machine, the mechanism of mobilization, is identical.
It is absolutely identical. The sources call this collective excellence through voluntary restraint. Min-jae voluntarily restrains his desire for a normal life so that the nation can achieve collective excellence. It creates what the political scientists call a sovereign agent capability. The Chaebols are not just companies. They are instruments of state power, capable of pivoting the entire national economy on a dime.
Which brings us right back to the weapon that this machine is currently building. We know the machine is efficient, we know it's ruthless, but we need to talk more about what exactly it's producing that has the most powerful country on Earth so spooked. Let's transition to the second story from our research.
The HBM hostage theory, the weapon itself.
Right. And for this, I want to introduce you to another character. Let's call him Mr. Park. He's not a young kid like Min-jae grinding it out. He's a senior engineer, been in the silicon industry for 30 years. He works at one of the big fabrication plants in Cheongju. I was reading a translation of his private blog, and the tone, it wasn't patriotic pride. It wasn't rah-rah, we're number one. It was anxiety, deep, gnawing anxiety.
What is a veteran like that worried about? If they're at the top of their game, what's the source of the fear?
He calls the current moment, this period of absolute dominance in HBM, the golden hour. He sees the HBM monopoly as a shield, yes, a powerful one, but he also sees it as a shield that is visibly rusting in real time.
It's a temporary advantage.
Exactly. He used this one metaphor that has really stuck with me. He said, "We are holding a live grenade to protect our house, hoping the neighbors need the house more than they fear the explosion."
That is, wow. That's an incredibly evocative and terrifying way to describe your national industrial strategy.
Isn't it? Because he's not looking at the U.S., he's looking at the calendar, he's looking at the year 2030, and he's looking east at China.
Right, because while Korea is locked in this staring contest with the U.S., China's not just sitting on the sidelines watching. They're playing a whole different game.
Before we get to the China threat, though, let's just double-click on the grenade itself. What makes HBM so special? Why is this the choke point? Why can't the U.S. just buy standard memory chips from Micron or somewhere else? Why does it have to be this specific piece of Korean tech?
Okay, so this gets a little technical, but it's really important. Think about how a computer works. You have the processor, the CPU or GPU, that's the brain. And you have the memory, the RAM, that's the short-term storage, the scratch pad.
The brain and its thoughts.
A pretty good analogy. Now, for AI, especially for training these huge large language models, the brain needs to access its thoughts at an impossible speed. In a traditional computer, the memory chips are like a library down the street. If the brain wants a piece of information, it has to send a request, walk down the street, find the right book, check it out, and walk back. That round trip takes time. It's called latency.
And for an AI doing literally trillions of calculations per second, that walk down the street is just too slow.
It's an eternity. It's the bottleneck that limits the entire system. HBM high bandwidth memory is the solution to that problem. It's like taking the entire library and, through some miracle of engineering, stacking it vertically, floor by floor, directly on top of the brain's office building.
So it's a 3D structure, not chips side by side, but chips on top of chips.
They use a technique that involves drilling thousands of microscopic vertical tunnels, called TSVs or through silicon vias, directly through the layers of silicon, connecting them into a single, massive skyscraper of memory. This allows data to flow instantly, vertically, between the processor and the memory. The walk down the street is now a 1-second elevator ride.
And the performance jump is massive.
It's game-changing. Jensen Huang from NVIDIA at CES this year, he called the demand for this kind of working memory for AI basically infinite. He said it was the single biggest unserved market in technology. You cannot run a modern high-performance data center without HBM. If you pull the HBM out, your trillion-dollar AI installation just becomes a very expensive, very loud room heater.
And Korea makes how much of the world's supply?
For the latest, most advanced generations of HBM, effectively all of it. Samsung and SK Hynix are the only two companies in the world who have mastered the incredibly difficult manufacturing process and have the yield rates, the percentage of good chips per wafer, to make it commercially viable.
So Mr. Park, the engineer, is holding this tiny chip in his hand, knowing that the entire multi-trillion-dollar AI economy depends on it. That is the leverage. That's the supply prioritization threat. It's a very polite way of saying, nice data center you've got there. It'd be a shame if it didn't have any memory to think with.
But here's the source of his anxiety. Here's why he feels like he's holding a grenade and not a crown jewel. He knows that in technology, nothing is indispensable forever. This is the trap of defensive realism. You are only safe for as long as you are absolutely essential.
And the golden hour is ticking down. The clock is running.
It's running fast. The sources we've seen indicate that China is pouring state resources into building their own domestic memory industry on a scale that makes the Apollo program look like a high school science project. They are throwing hundreds of billions of dollars at this problem. They are hiring Korean engineers. They are acquiring technology through various means.
And they're catching up.
They are catching up. Maybe they won't have a competitive HBM product next year or the year after, but by 2030. The consensus is they will have a good enough alternative. And the economic moat that Korea has painstakingly built around itself is going to be filled with Chinese sand.
So the gamble is you have to use the hostage now. You have to squeeze the U.S. for a long-term favorable trade deal now, because in 5 or 6 years, the Americans might be able to buy their HBM from somewhere else, or maybe the Chinese just flood the market with cheap alternatives and the price crashes for everyone. The leverage vanishes.
It's a terrifyingly narrow window of opportunity. The Korean government isn't fighting for some permanent victory. They know that's impossible. They're fighting for what they call civilizational survival rights for the next decade. They're betting the entire national economy that they can force Washington to blink before their strategic advantage evaporates.
It's the highest stakes poker game in the world. And the chips are, well, they're literally chips. But there's a third element here, and it might be the most important. We've talked about the machine, the Chaebols system. We've talked about the weapon, the HBM monopoly. But machines need fuel. And in this case, the fuel is human sacrifice.
The cost, the human cost of this strategy.
I want to tell you about the third story from our research. And honestly, this one hit me the hardest. It's about a young woman named Ji-won living in Seoul.
This is the demographic angle, isn't it? The birth rate.
But it's so much more than just statistics. We've all seen the headlines. Korea has the lowest birth rate in the developed world. It's down to 0.7, 0.6. Numbers that demographers will tell you technically mean extinction if they continue. But listening to Ji-won explain her choice, it wasn't presented as a tragedy to her. It was a cold, hard calculation.
Go on.
Ji-won has decided with absolute certainty that she will never have children. And she was very clear about this in the interview I read. This isn't a political statement in the Western feminist sense. She's not primarily protesting the patriarchy, though she acknowledges that's part of it. She calls her choice a fulfillment of the meritocratic survival contract.
What on earth is a meritocratic survival contract?
She looks at the society around her, the 16-hour workdays of people like Kim Min-jae, the insane, soul-crushing pressure of the education system from the age of 5, the impossibility of buying a home, and she says, I cannot, in good conscience, bring a child into this high-pressure furnace.
So she views not having a child as an act of mercy.
It's more than that. She views it as a patriotic duty. She used a phrase that is just chilling. She called it civilizational hygiene. Isn't it? Civilizational hygiene. Her logic goes like this. For Korea to maintain this Chaebol edge, to keep the national machine running fast enough and hard enough to produce the HBM that holds off the US and China, the society must remain a pressure cooker. There's no room for softness.
So if you lower the temperature,
if you lower the temperature to make life livable, with things like work-life balance and affordable housing and less educational pressure, the national efficiency drops. If efficiency drops, the HBM yield drops. If the yield drops, the leverage is gone, and the nation becomes, in her words, a vassal state to its larger neighbors.
So she is consciously trading the nation's biological future for its technological dominance in the present.
That's exactly. She accepts this gratification, she accepts the harshness, she accepts that she will be the last of her family line. Because the alternative, in her mind, is the collapse of national sovereignty. It is the East Asian meritocratic trade-off taken to its absolute, brutal, logical extreme.
The sources we looked at refer to this mindset as civilizational stamina. The elite-driven state capitalist governance model requires a population that is willing to burn itself out for the collective. And what's so fascinating, and frankly so sad, is that there's a historical basis for this acceptance. The research mentions Park Chung-hee nostalgia.
Nostalgia for a military dictator. To a Western ear, that sounds insane.
But it's not nostalgia for the authoritarianism. It's nostalgia for the clarity. Nostalgia for a time when the sacrifice had a clear and immediate reward. The deal was simple. We will work ourselves to the bone, we will sacrifice our freedoms, and in return, we will get rich and our country will be safe. For a generation, that deal held. Ji-woon is living in the aftermath of that deal. She's the one paying the final demographic bill.
It's the silence of the nursery versus the hum of the server room. And as a nation, they've been forced to choose the server room.
It creates what one analyst called the soulful resolve of the cyber fortress. Korea has turned itself into a fortress. And inside the walls of a fortress, life is not meant to be comfortable. It's meant to be sustainable for the siege. The work never ends. Space is tight. But the fortress stands. The walls hold.
It's overwhelming when you try to connect all these dots. You start with a dried trade dispute about tariff codes in Washington, and you end up in a 3-square-meter Goseon in Gangnam with a man who never sleeps, and then in a small apartment in Seoul with a woman who will never be a mother.
But they are all the same story. You cannot have the weapon Mr. Park's HBM grenade without the mechanism Kim Min-jae's sleepless labor, and you cannot sustain that mechanism without the Kosh-Ji-won's demographic sacrifice. They are three sides of the same triangle. And the technocrats in that glass office on the Han River, they know this. They're the architects of this triangle. They're betting everything this structure can hold.
They're betting that the mechanism, the weapon, and the cost all together can buy them just enough time to secure a future.
Or at the very least, to avoid becoming a footnote in someone else's history book.
You know, we started this entire deep dive with that image, the single HBM chip resting on a velvet cloth. This tiny, thumb-sized piece of silicon that has, for now, halted a trade war with a superpower. It is an incredible triumph of engineering. It's a breathtaking triumph of national strategy. Korea has successfully turned a commercial product into a hostage to tame a global power. That is no small feat.
It's astonishingly impressive. It is the ultimate real-world application of defensive realism, a masterclass in asymmetrical leverage.
But when you look at Kim Min-jae, and you look at Mr. Park holding his grenade, and you listen to Ji-won talking about civilizational hygiene, that victory feels incredibly heavy. It feels brittle.
It does, very brittle.
And the sources we've looked through, they really leave us with this one final lingering thought. Korea has built itself into a cyber fortress. It's a marvel of collective will. But if your entire national sovereignty, your whole strategy for survival is tied to a single point of failure, a single type of chip produced by a single, unified, and utterly exhausted workforce, you have to wonder if that is true sovereignty. It might just be a temporary reprieve before the bill for that survival finally comes due. The question isn't whether the hostage strategy will work against Washington today. The real issue is that when that golden hour finally ends in 2030 and the leverage is gone, it leaves you wondering if there will be enough of the nation left to enjoy the survival they fought so hard for.